Tensions between the bloc of democratic countries and the Beijing-Moscow camp reveal similarities with the Cold War era. But is the world facing a new Cold War? We can see that the current geopolitical and economic situation includes certain components that define a Cold War: countries increasing defense spending, supporting allies with military aid against rivals, and imposing sanctions on Russia. The US and Eastern European countries are bolstering their militaries in multilateral cooperation for national security. US foreign military and economic aid reached $51 billion in 2020. US defense spending is more than 3% of its gross domestic product, making the US one of only 9 of the alliance's 30 members to reach the NATO defense target in 2022. Poland has become a much more influential player in the European defense than ever. Poland is also ramping up its defense spending from 2.2% of its gross domestic product to a record of 3% in 2023, one of the highest rates within NATO. Warsaw is purchasing tanks and self-propelled howitzers from South Korea in a deal worth $5.76 billion and will acquire state-of-the-art F-35 fighters from the US in the coming years. The Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia will also hit a target of spending 2.5% of their GDPs over the next few years. Despite Western sanctions against Russia, Moscow has taken an alternative path by turning to China to boost its economy and help negate Western sanctions. Russia's ambassador to China anticipates that the Russian-Chinese trade turnover could exceed $200 billion with a large margin in 2023. Last April, the U.S. Commerce Department put 5 firms based in China on its entity list, banning them from trading with U.S. firms in suspicion of assisting Russia in its war against Ukraine. My colleague Harun Karčić will further uncover the evolving Cold War and distinguish the fundamental differences with Stephen Flanagan, a senior fellow at the RAND Corporation.
So Stephen Flanagan, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Now, the first question I have for you is really simple. Are the United States and Russia back to Cold War settings?
Well, for us, it's certainly as almost the relationship is as tense as the Cold War period, and the lack of high-level dialogue, the fact that many of the arms control agreements have collapsed in recent years. The one agreement that was still in place, the Strategic Arms Limitation New START, seems to also be unraveling. So there is certainly a deepening sense of tension, and even if one listens to President Putin's comments today at the Victory Day celebration in Moscow, where he was essentially claiming that the West was waging a proxy war on the Russian Federation in Ukraine. Yes, so that there are certainly many elements. Now, it is certainly, there is not as much of a risk, I think, of some of the escalation and missteps that had been in place at various times earlier in the U.S.-Soviet relationship, say, back in the depths of the 1960s, or if you went back to the Cuban Missile Crisis or other events. Fortunately, we haven't seen things that have reached quite that level of tension. But certainly, as you look at what the Biden administration has been saying about the war in Ukraine and about the approach that NATO has taken towards supporting Ukraine, there is a concern, particularly in the face of some of the nuclear saber rattling that President Putin has undertaken from time to time, that you could see an incident or an event in Ukraine, or perhaps some kind of military encounter between Russian and NATO forces that would lead to some kind of more direct confrontation with the potential for escalation. So that's out there certainly as a factor, but not nearly as intense as at the height of the Cold War.
Now, Stefan, what is the most surprising event of the past year, excluding the fact that Russia invaded Ukraine?
Well, in terms of the war itself, I think the most surprising development was the robustness of the Ukrainian ability to rebuff the Russian offensive and to retain a good deal of its territorial integrity, even though it had lost a fair amount of territory in the conflict. So, so I guess to be more direct, the weaknesses of the Russian military, particularly the ground forces, and the way in which they performed, I think is a real blow to Russia's standing and the fear that a number of governments have about Russia. That now, of course, the army, the ground forces have taken a huge number of losses and great damage to their capabilities. All of the a good part, all of the nuclear forces, and certainly many of the air and naval forces that Russia has in its arsenal remain. So those still remain quite formidable and are elements of Russian power that the West has to take into account at all times. In terms of the global surprise, I guess I would say the biggest surprise to me is the gains that Russia has made in the southern parts of the world. I mean, for lack of a better term, the global South. But in Africa, in parts even of Latin America and Southeast Asia, where it has somehow gained traction for its argument that the West is responsible for the war in Ukraine, and that it is the Western actions that are disrupting grain flows and other kinds of benefits that would normally be accruing to some of the wider community through normal trade in the Black Sea region. So I would say on a global basis, that's the event that has surprised me the most, that that many countries, in Africa and elsewhere, have bought into, or at least seem to be willing to accept this Russian argument that the West is to blame for this crisis and the disruption to the global economy, and particularly in the transit of foodstuffs that has resulted from it.
Now, let's dwell a little bit longer on Russia's military might. I mean, for many, many years, I've been reading reports on how Vladimir Putin was investing millions, if not billions of dollars in modernizing Russia's military forces. It was really presented as a formidable fighting force. However, since Russia invaded Ukraine, its armed forces turned out to be a paper tiger. How did we get it so wrong?
Well, I guess I wouldn't say Russia's a paper tiger, but it's certainly less effective and a less powerful military than we would have expected. Now, they haven't used, of course, the Russians have not used all of the capability. For whatever reason, they haven't used their air power as much as some might have been. And they have been obviously using these drone strikes and these long-range cruise missiles fired from bombers, sometimes over the Black Sea or elsewhere in the Russian Federation territory, as weapons of terror against the Ukrainian population, and to perhaps try to deplete some of their air defenses in Ukraine before the expected Ukrainian offensive. But so the Russian military capabilities certainly have not, the investments that they've made, and they've shown that the precision kind of strike weapons that they have are not nearly as effective as they had envisioned. That they don't have as many of them, it appears, and there were Western analysts, including some of my colleagues at RAND, who were saying that the depth of what military people would say, the depth of their magazine, that is the number of these high performance cruise missiles, the dreaded Caliber in particular cruise missile that they have, that they don't quite have as many of those as they would like. And even now we see signs that Russia is running out of ammunition, running out of that their forces are claiming, both the regular forces and Prigozhin's contract forces are claiming that they don't have sufficient ammunition and supplies. So the Russian logistics chain, and that seems in many ways to be, as much as anything, the way in which they deployed their forces, and particularly their logistical support, was woefully lacking, and was one of the reasons why they weren't able to attack Kiev early on, and when they tried to seize Hostomel airport with soldiers who were coming in with their dress uniforms, expecting that they would be marching in the streets of Kiev within a few days. So that proved to be very much of a surprise, certainly to the Russian military planners, and who I think were suffering from a bit of hubris on the notion that Ukraine was a paper tiger and that they would quickly roll over the Ukrainian armed forces.
Right. I mean, do you see any signs that the Russian military is recognizing its own errors and making course corrections?
Yes, I think my colleagues who follow and others who follow the military developments closely do feel that the Russians have made some adjustments in their tactics and procedures, which is, on the other hand, they're still undertaking some very kind of senseless or seemingly senseless operation, in terms of the Bakhmut, the operations there where literally Prigozhin was, as he was reviewing even himself, showing all the thousands of contract soldiers who were were lying dead in that offensive against Bakhmut. So I think that, but on the other hand, the regular Russian military has made some adjustments in the way in which they're employing some of their forces, and they, of course, have begun to dig in positions along the lines of defense. They certainly expect that the Ukrainians will try to disrupt their so-called land bridge that they created when they moved forces out of Crimea and into southern Ukraine, and that area between there and the Donbass, where they're able to supply some of their forces in various ways. Certainly, the Ukrainians haven't signaled which way they'll go, but that certainly is one of the things that I think the Russians are anticipating, that the Ukrainians will try to cut off their land bridge, or at least make a dent into it, and that would be certainly disruptive and set the Russian forces back in their ability to sustain their presence, not only in southern Ukraine, but also in the Donbass region.
Right. I mean, let's talk about President Zelensky for a while. I'm wondering if you could encapsulate your feelings about him, your analysis of his leadership, and obviously fold into that your understanding of how President Biden understands the performance of President Zelensky over the past year and a half.
Well, there's no doubt that President Zelensky is perhaps one of the most brilliant communicators as a political leader that I've ever seen, both to his own people and to the wider world. The way in which he has risen to this occasion, clearly, many people I think underestimated him. There was suggestion even, not long before the war, where there was some who were suggesting that it would be very, would not be surprising if somehow, the war, turned badly quickly and he was evicted from office. Instead, beginning with his famous line, rebuffing suggestions from the West and others that, that he should evacuate and move somewhere else. He said he didn't want to ride, he wanted weapons. From that day forward, I think he has been masterful in the way in which he has helped to orchestrate, working with, in fairness, with President Biden, with a number of other key allies, with the NATO Secretary General, other European leaders, who have definitely come to rally to his cause and to maintain a strong sense of solidarity. And even though there have been voices in some quarters in the West, including in the United States, and some elements of the Congress suggesting that we can't just keep endlessly supporting Ukraine, there's very much still a strong level of support that was affirmed recently by even the Republican leader in the House of Representatives, Kevin McCarthy, that there needs to be continued support for Ukraine, and he's trying to, I think, manage some of the relatively small number of dissidents in his own caucus in the Congress who are both skeptical of Ukraine and Ukraine's capabilities, and also arguing that the United States should spend more effort deterring China or fighting against the growth of Chinese influence around the world.
Now, let's stay a little bit further on the subject of the alliance. There are obviously many countries in the alliance that the US has helped to construct, and quite obviously NATO is reinvigorated by what is happening in Ukraine. However, you see a lot of these countries, many US allies such as the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, even Israel, staying on the sidelines and not engaging to the level that certainly Ukraine would want them to engage in. How do you make sense of that?
Well, NATO is an alliance of 30 countries, sovereign countries who have the right to make their own decisions. There's no security obligation to Ukraine, but there is, and indeed NATO as an organization, a lot of the support that Ukraine has been receiving has been by NATO member countries. There is some collective NATO support to training and development, just as there is EU support to some of the training and development of some of the Ukrainian armed forces. But yeah, there's certainly disappointment I think in the United States and government and elsewhere in Europe that some countries have been sitting a bit on the fence. Hungary, for example, within the alliance. I mean, Turkey is engaged in a very difficult balancing act. They have done, certainly they've continued to support Ukraine's membership, objecting to Russian aggression, the closing the straits, the Bosphorus Straits, to warships. That has also, although after the Russians had moved in a good bit of their amphibious and other equipment to support the war effort last year. Nonetheless, Turkey has continued to provide the Ukrainians with some of the drones that they have been using, their TB2 and other drones that they've provided. They've done it somewhat quietly sometimes. They've not wanted to, because they're worried about provoking a conflict with Russia, either on their southern border in Syria or perhaps something in the Black Sea. And Turkey also has tried to play this role of as it helped to broker with the United Nations the grain deal that allowed some of the grain to move out of, they've still, particularly this current president Erdogan has wanted to try to suggest that Turkey can be a good, loyal NATO ally, but also engage in dialogue with Russia in a way that can be, and other countries that NATO has difficulty with, and be helpful. So.
Right. Now, let me ask you one question about domestic politics. Obviously, you're well aware that it is much harder to build a coherent foreign policy when American politics is often incoherent. I'm wondering how that affects America's ability to sustain what could be a very, very long and costly campaign to keep Ukraine fighting effectively, and then to protect Ukraine or help Ukraine protect itself.
No, it is definitely a challenge, as you say, Faris. It's there's definitely a recognition that there will be, over time, just as we've seen in other conflicts, there'll be domestic fatigue with this notion. And some people now, looking, and even there have been news reports that the Ukrainians themselves are apprehensive that expectations in the West about the gains that they might make in the coming offensive in recapturing territory are maybe way out of whack with the reality of their capabilities and the kind of resistance they'd meet from the Russian forces. So this year certainly is decisive. I don't think the window will slam shut at the end of this year. There are some military analysts who argue this could go on, as you suggest, for several years, even if this offensive begins. It's easy to forget that this war really has been going on in the Donbass region since 2014, and then Ukrainians have fought valiantly in that and limited Russian gains against, even though they were fighting against a mix of Russian supported forces in the Donbass region and also regular Russian forces with support. But I think that there has been remarkable cohesion in the alliance. I mean, no one has really moved to block any of the key NATO actions. All of the allies, including Hungary, as I said, which has been more hesitant about support to Ukraine, agreed to the establishment of what's called the enhanced forward presence battle groups. These NATO presences that are forces that are not quite at the brigade level, but supposedly being available to go up to that level in each of the 8 NATO countries that, except for Finland now, but the 8 NATO countries bordering Europe from Estonia to Bulgaria along the so-called Eastern Front, if you will, although it's not yet a front, it's not really a war front yet, but it is a deterrent front. And so the allies have come together in Madrid, and they will be coming together again in Vilnius in July. And I expect no wavering of that support for continuing to maintain deterrence, continuing to support Ukraine. And one of the key questions at the Vilnius summit will be what more is said about long-term support to Ukraine. Will Ukraine be offered, as it has been seeking, a membership action plan that is a roadmap to join NATO, or could it be offered something else? that would be help to advance their path towards NATO membership at some point, but be short of that membership action plan, or not the same as which was used for the countries that joined NATO in the 1990s and early 2000s.
Right, and finally, I mean, does the Ukraine reinvasion over the last year make it more likely or less likely that China will do something precipitous against Taiwan in the near future?
Well, I think that I'm certainly I'm not an expert on the Chinese military calculations, or at this point in time, I have done work on that issue over the course of my career. But I think that I think Xi Jinping and his leadership in the People's Liberation Army has taken some note of the kind of obstacles that Russia has met. Well, when they've been flexing their muscles against Taiwan and launching undertaking these exercises, launching multiple rocket attacks, or rocket launches, not attacks against Taiwan, of course. But I think I think China has its own calculus as to what it certainly benefits from having the West being, if you will, distracted or focused on the defense of Ukraine in undertaking some of the preparations, and certainly it could come to a point where, if not this year, maybe next year or a year after that, if there's still this conflict going on, where they where the Chinese leadership takes a decision that says, well, now is the time. But excuse me, I think their decision on whether or not to use military force against Taiwan is driven by other calculations, including whether they think, just as Russia said that was a red line, although we now know that it was really not NATO membership that caused the invasion or forced the invasion, or why they undertook the invasion. It was much a broader goal of eliminating Ukraine as an entity, as a nationality, and really eradicating Ukraine from the map. At some level, the Chinese have somewhat the same. They view Taiwan as a renegade province. The mainland, is seeking reunification. But I think if there was a sense that, so the Russians, where I was going with that is the Russians said, if Ukraine were to join NATO, that would be a casus belli. That would cause, be a thing that would cause an invasion. If Taiwan were seen as moving, under the current government or another government in the future as moving, taking some step that was seen as, almost irrevocable in terms of independence, then I think China then might then move militarily. But I don't think it's driven, or it would not primarily hinge on what was going on with regard to the Western engagement in Ukraine and support to Ukraine.
Right, Stephen Flanagan, it was such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
The presence of a new Cold War is evident from the urgency of countries advancing military and economic areas, pushing for NATO and EU expansion, and tightening sanctions against Russia. With a new Cold War, what are some of its main challenges? Among them are the unclear motives of camps from particular countries such as Turkey. Turkey has conducted a diplomatic balancing act between Russia and Ukraine and taken advantage of NATO, hindering Finland's and Sweden's accession into NATO. At the same time, Turkey has also criticized Russia's invasion and sent armed drones to Ukraine. Another challenge lies in the control of the Black Sea. The Black Sea is a central part of Russia's strategy in the war and one of the main reasons it annexed Crimea. The US and its NATO allies aim to counter Russian influence in the Black Sea to retain their influence on Europe's southeastern flank. In the face of an anticipated Ukrainian counteroffensive that might potentially target Crimea this spring, an area of focus is also on comprising the Black Sea in the West strategy. Russia's war on Ukraine has prompted Europeans to rethink their place in the world, where Eastern European countries in the pursuit of democracy still contain a camp of pro-Russian initiatives. The new Cold War is forming a competition among multiple centers of power, with countries reluctant to be led into either side, the Western and Eastern blocs, instead maintaining balanced initiatives in pursuit of national interests.